Hi, everyone. For those of you that know me, my name is Lady Declaration. I kind of emerged in the year of 2020 because of all the things that are happening within our time and in our government and our country. So all of the events sort of made me resurrect back from 1776 to kind of help draw the bridge between 1775, 1776, and today's modern world. And so because of that, I was actually able to get Zoom technology over to our dear Miss Abigail Adams. So I wanted to start off by kind of talking about things that are going on in the modern world today. And our president is talking a lot about the United States postal system. So I was wondering, if you could tell us a little bit about the Postal Service, how it formed and what it was like back for you and your husband.
Well, I appreciate so much you asking me to join you. I'm very honored and I'm very humbled to have my opinion asked. And this device that you have conjured is truly remarkable. I certainly believe very strongly in the Postal Service. It has been the link between myself and my husband in our marriage during his absences while he's been away in Philadelphia with the Continental Congress, while he was in Boston at his law practice and I was at Braintree with the family. And the Postal Service has been our only means of communication, the only way that we could share news with each other, the only way that we could send our affection to each other. And in our marriage, being able to share those things is the only thing that sustains me and sustains the children. The Postal Service is not perfect. There are different methods of sending letters to each other. Sometimes if a friend is going to be traveling, I can hand them my letter and make sure that it gets into John's hands. Other times we do have to depend on the men riding across the country to deliver the letters through storms, through terrible roads that are not maintained, through awful, awful enemy attacks. And it is never certain that a letter will in fact arrive. And the cost of the paper and the cost of the transmission of a letter varies depending on how many pieces of paper or how many sentiments one wishes to send to one's dearest friend. And it is never certain that it will arrive. But all of that being said, I strongly, strongly support any system by which people can communicate with each other, and feel that if it were to suddenly lose its support from the government and from the individual states that are managing the system as best they can, that would indeed be perhaps the worst thing I could think of because of its importance in our marriage and our relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that, when it comes to today, how the postal system works, you talk about using letters and sentiments to kind of help keep up communication, and kind of how it's been changed today. People still write letters, but not at the same, multitude, I guess is the right word. People now use the Postal Service to obviously still receive information and still have communication, but also to receive actual items too. Like now we're able to really keep the Postal Service because of what it delivers to everyone within the nation. Whereas now we have competing delivery services. So the benefits of the Postal Service is every American citizen can still communicate with one another and still have contact to the rest of the country. Whereas some of the more modern technologies that we have in 2020, things like Amazon and even FedEx and UPS, they're not as common in every community as is the Postal Service. So something for like you and John, uh, at least there's like a greater access through the postal system, you know.
Indeed. And when the sending of parcels or of letters goes into the control of a particular person or a particular entity who is then profiting in a different way, I would say, than in the mere access of the postal service that we have, it makes it, as you say, it makes it less possible for people who are not able to furnish the funds to use that service. And indeed, when it is less certain that the postal service is able to carry a letter, if you don't have a friend to hand a letter to who will be traveling in the proper direction, that would leave you bereft. That would leave you entirely cut off from your friends and your family and any other important communication that you require.
So, speaking from just the modern era, can you give a little bit of a background on the Postal Service and just how that kind of formed and maybe what role you and your husband played in that?
So the Postal Service now is very fractured. It is managed individually by each colony, by each postmaster, who determines the amount that it costs to send a letter, the amount that depending on the distance that the letter must travel, depending on the amount of paper. Paper is itself very expensive and becoming more so as a result of the Stamp Act. But there is a postmaster general, but he is not empowered to ensure that the Postal Service functions in the same way in every colony. And depending on whether a colony is loyalist or patriot, they might be charging higher costs in order for letters to travel. So it is not managed centrally. It is not taken in hand by the government in a way that allows, as you say, that free access to all people in the colonies. We are in the process of determining whether or not these colonies will become an independent nation. And it is certainly my hope that at that point, the Postal Service will be in some way better regulated. But as it is every colony for itself, and you only know what your letters will cost as far as they reach the borders of your colony.
So basically, I just have a question for myself, is even the way that you're having mail delivered, are you paying for, I know that you're paying for like the paper and the products, but are you paying the actual delivery person out of your own pocket to send that mail? Am I understanding that?
Correct. So the recipient of a letter is the one who pays the person who delivered it. And yes, it is a matter of economy to restrict oneself to as few sheets of paper as possible, as that is the means by which the cost is determined. So in many cases, a person who has filled, for example, an entire letter might then turn it to one side and write across the lines that they have already written, and then perhaps turn it upside down and write in between the lines that were previously written in order to save paper.
I mean, if that's the case, then how did you guys even address like letters to another person? I mean, if you're using all forms of the piece of paper itself, I mean.
Yes, so the way that a letter is folded, you write on the inside of the paper, and then you might place that inside another piece of paper and put the direction on the outside here. And then the seal is on this side. So the ability to create something of an envelope out of one piece of paper does maintain the privacy of the contents of the letter, but it also increases the cost of the letter for the recipient.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Well, ultimately, I can tell you that, spoiler alert, ultimately the Postal Service is then adopted into our US Constitution. So you guys will end up winning the war.
Well, that is good to know.
Maybe tell all your friends to just keep fighting the good fight. But it's interesting because I'm resurrected also from your time, and I sort of woke up into 2020, and I've had to do a lot of back research as to how the postal system has changed, throughout time. So, I mean, do you want to know anything about like how it
has it become easier to ensure that a letter will get where it is going?
It's a tricky question. I would say that yes, it is easier to ensure because in the 1800s, I think it might have been in the 1850s at some point, they ended up doing anytime you would send a letter, you could then receive a receipt that you sent the letter, and then you can find out if it actually was delivered. So that was adopted maybe 70 years after,
That is excellent.
Yeah.
The reason I ask is because John has sent a letter to me that did not reach me, but instead was intercepted by someone who wished to denigrate his character and in fact published his letter in the newspaper.
Oh.
So one's private correspondence, whether or not one sends a letter through a postal messenger or a friend or family member, is always subject to scrutiny and is always subject to the hazards of travel. If a letter had to be sent overseas, there was no guarantee that the ship would not either sink or be attacked, or that the cargo would have to be thrown overboard in order to lighten the load somehow. Mm-hmm. And being able to receive a piece of paper indicating that yes, your letter did reach its destination would be a balm indeed to the worrisome heart of a wife.
Yes. No, we've ultimately adopted a system that helps be sure that mail is received. Now, in 2020, there is talk of, the Postal Service, it's so interesting. Ultimately, once we become independent, the U.S. Postal Service is then adopted into the Constitution as part of the Constitution. It becomes a department overseen by, from my understanding, by the U.S. government. And then in the, about 100 years later, it's then adopted as a cabinet position within the United States executive branch. So ultimately, the form of connecting the nation and correspondence is incredibly important. And, but, fast forward a little bit more, and we kind of get to sort of where we're at today, is that in 1970, there was a Postal Reorganization Act that basically made the Postal Service no longer a cabinet position and no longer a department of the US government, but instead a postal service. So by doing so, what was once funded by American taxpayer dollars is now part of a collective bargaining agreement, and the Postal Service can now, they have benefits for their employees, which, I don't know how much you and John feel about healthcare, but the postal workers can now work on having their own healthcare and things like that as of 1970. But by doing so, they no longer receive full-on federal, not as much federal money because they're not receiving taxpayer dollars. So fast forward a little bit more, over the last 30, 40 years, the government has been slowly dwindling down the money owed to the U.S. Postal Service. And today, for some reason, our president wants to eliminate funding even more. That would then make it difficult for us to receive letters and parcels as it was back in your time. So it's interesting that it's sort of gone through this big array of importance, and now it's, there's a lot of issues going on with it. And so the question of, will we receive mail on time as before, is now back into question. And I don't know.
That is, it is not surprising to me to learn that people are wary of the government having a certain degree of control over something as important as receiving one's letters and parcels on time. There is certainly from our perspective, the government that we wrested our independence from was very corrupt. And we intended, in declaring independency and in creating a new nation, to avoid all tyrannical activity by the government. Mm-hmm. And the ability of the government to do anything it felt without any check on its power was something that was very much to be avoided. The power of a king is not what this country is to be founded on. Mm-hmm. And if there are no limits to the government's power, then we will have grossly failed at the system of government that was in John's mind and in Franklin's mind and in all the other fine gentlemen of the Congress who intended to avoid those abilities by the government.
It's very interesting. So you found that King George had a sense of control over how information was distributed amongst you.
Indeed, because the Stamp Act required that all paper have the stamp of the British governor before it could be used. And that included paper for writing letters, paper for distributing pamphlets, paper for printing books. And that fundamental right of information and reading and educating oneself was in fact being curtailed. And the ability of the colonies to manage our own distribution of information and of literature was grossly under attack. Mm-hmm. And that system of control was indeed one of the very main concerns in breaking from England, in that we would have that control back. But having that control and having that power, it would seem, can also be a corrupting factor. And therefore, the importance of placing those limits on an individual person in government, I believe, is very important, so that there is no opportunity for them to take complete control over any one aspect of governing a nation.
Mm-hmm. Well, hence the brilliance of your husband and his friends of having the idea of, checks and balances within the judicial system. It's pretty brilliant when it's used properly.
And John was instrumental in writing the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, from which many of those ideals, I believe, would be drawn on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So how would you find information distributed to those who couldn't read or write back during your time?
There are schools, mostly for boys, very, very few opportunities for girls to learn anything beyond what their families are willing to provide for them. And people who are not able to read and write, people who have not had the benefit of either an education at home or an education at a school, there is very little that is provided for them, particularly of the enslaved population that has had their manumission. It is in most colonies illegal to teach one's slaves to read, and tradespeople, if they take on an apprentice, it is included usually in those agreements for those young people to be taught to read and write and cipher. But for people who have not had the benefit of an education, it's very true. There is not a provision made for them to be able to participate in the democratic process, unless they themselves take the initiative to learn to read and write. And that is indeed a failing. That is very much a concern, in that only men of property who have had the benefit of education are making decisions and are determining the direction of the country. And indeed, when John was actively seeking independence through the work of the Continental Congress, I wrote to him indicating that in this new country, in this new code of laws that would be written for this country, it would be important to consider that women have no voice or representation, and have had no voice or representation, that we have not been able to participate, in spite of many of us being very well educated and very well aware of what has been happening, that we are not in a position to make our thoughts and our ideas known through participation in government. And John unfortunately wrote back to say that he could not but laugh at my proposal, and believed that it was best for men to maintain the situation in which they find themselves, of having the ability to make such decisions. Otherwise, there would be a despotism of the petticoat, a race rising up in rebellion that would upend life as we know it.
Life as men know it, of course. Privileged white men. Yeah, it's very interesting how the decisions of how they formed the government were made. In so many ways, it was brilliant, especially for the time, but also there was a lot of oversight that happened. And a lot of things that the country has then had to go back and fix, of, oh, maybe we shouldn't have enslaved peoples. Oh, maybe we should allow Black men to vote. Oh, maybe let's allow women to vote. Oh, wait, but not Black women. And it took, almost 190 years to finally secure the vote for Black women. And I find the process of how, Americans, but also just humans in general, of how it takes a long time of constant pushing and urging to move forward. So, of course, what John and, our other founding fathers did, they pushed forward towards a new system. But the system was not without flaws, as we know. But it's also, again, in some ways, the ways that checks and balances work within government is brilliant, again, when used properly. And, but yeah, So, but basically, women weren't allowed the right to vote back in 1775.
It depended. There in fact were, as these individual colonies became the United States of America, varying states determined that they would in fact allow women of property to participate in the democratic process. However, some that began allowing it then determined that it needed to be taken away again. And in 1797, I would write to my sister that had my colony, had my state, the same provision as New Jersey, I would put my support behind Mr. Whitman. He was running for office. And New Jersey was, I believe at that time, the only state allowing women to vote. And it was the last of several that was still allowing that. And then that was also taken away.
Why was it taken away?
You would probably have to ask the men in power. I believe that it was determined that women of property were still not prepared to participate in the democratic process as well as men. And now that is a failing in education, of course, but that is a determination that you can understand why the men who had paved the way for women to be educated and participate in the democratic process would then realize that they did not want that to be the case anymore.
Pretty interesting. Well, thankfully now we've won the vote. The issue is now, as you know, I was saying earlier, is well, I don't know if you're aware, but we're in a pandemic in 2020. So I don't know what experience you've had with diseases for you, John.
More than I care to remember. Yes, there have been many, many distempers and epidemics in my time, of the smallpox, of dysentery, of typhoid. And every time there are many families who lose loved ones, who lose members of their household. And in learning that there was in fact a way to not necessarily prevent, but to lessen the effect of a disease such as the smallpox. John was in fact quick to be inoculated. He in fact, it delayed our marriage. He was inoculated in the spring of 1764. Because he had to quarantine for several months after that, we were not able to be married until October. Inoculation did not mean that it was certain you would not fall ill from the smallpox, but it might, should another epidemic arise, it might make your symptoms less extreme. And in fact, Dr. Franklin and his wife were uncertain as to whether or not they should inoculate their young son. And unfortunately, he contracted the smallpox and died as a result. There was no knowing whether an inoculation would have saved his life, but the possibility that it might have was a matter of deep regret to Dr. Franklin for the rest of his life. And in finding a way to make some sense and to have some control over a situation such as that, there is a degree of comfort. There is a degree of relief that you have done the best you can. And indeed, I and my family, my household, and several friends and relatives of mine were quarantined at my uncle's home in Boston in the summer of 1776, and all of us were inoculated against the smallpox in order to prevent future outbreaks amongst our family, if we could. And the quarantine is difficult. The quarantine is long. there is no knowing whether anyone will become extremely ill and die as a result of inoculation. But it is something. It is something to at least possibly make the disease less extreme.
Well, how did inoculation work in the 1770s?
So a small incision would be made in the arm, either the upper arm or the lower arm, and a piece of thread impregnated with the pox would be inserted into the incision. And in the case of my daughter Natty, she actually underwent that procedure 3 times because we wanted to be certain that it had actually taken hold. And she began to erupt in the pox after the 3rd application. And in my son's, it was a fairly mild eruption, and my entire family underwent that procedure to varying degrees of illness, but we maintained a level of cheerfulness and activity to the best of our abilities during that time. And of course, I wrote to John very regularly during that time in order to assure him that we were all still well and that we were proceeding with caution and with faith that everything would turn out well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm here to assure you that, 300, 400 years later, vaccinations, inoculation, well, we call inoculation now vaccines, and the process of how they're created and how they're made are far more stable than they were back in your time.
That is a relief to learn.
Yeah, that even the way that they find vaccines is, it's kind of unbelievable. We've been able to find a way past smallpox, polio, tuberculosis. I mean, tuberculosis is still around, obviously, but there are ways to prevent diseases. And, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic of our own, and we're kind of patiently and very urgently waiting for the vaccine to come out. But even the process of doing that, it's not just, hope and a prayer. We have scientists now going through, huge trials to make sure that what you put into your body is safe. And there is a nice, it's more than just a comfort. It's a, true assurance that, the science community is doing things safely now for us in 2020. But, kind of going back to mail carrying then and how things are now, right now the big topic is because we're in a pandemic, we're looking at doing more mail-in voting because since we don't have a vaccine yet, being in large crowds isn't exactly the safest thing. So for those who cannot will really be in person, they're going to vote by mail. And it's sort of a heated topic right now amongst some of the parties because they think that mail-in voting is fraudulent, when really mail-in voting, for as far as I know, has gone back to the 19th century. And some of our states now do completely vote by mail for years. So it's a sort of an interesting idea. But I was wondering, how did voting work once, you became independent and the Congress happened? What was that process? Did they vote by mail or did they vote in person as I don't even know how voting worked, and if it was just amongst the complete elite, or Did every property owner get to vote? How did that work?
Again, yes, it varies between each individual state as they are developing the rules by which they wish to be self-governed as a state and also governed as part of the United States. But property owners in some states, yes, male and female property owners. In others, only male property owners would either in person voice their support for one or the other person running for a particular office, or write it on a piece of paper and it would go into a sealed box to be counted. And I believe that if there had been a system of sending in your vote by mail, that would be extremely difficult to manage because of the problems that I had spoken of before, that you could never really be certain that a letter would reach its destination. And because the carrying of the mail was believed to be a very important duty and one that postal carriers would take very seriously, there were still people who would wait by the side of the road to overtake a postal carrier or a carriage.
Now that's a crime. That's a crime in our United States. So don't worry about that.
But indeed, the uncertainty of the delivery of the mail, I believe, would make people very nervous to to send in their votes in that method. So it is heartening to know that being able to send in your vote by mail is now some people's preferred method and some people's only method, it would seem, if you live too distant from a place of vote counting. If you are not able to travel or to make your way there on foot, then being able to vote by mail would be a very heartening exercise.
Yeah. And like I said earlier, I mean, even just the way that tracking now works, I don't even know if you even understand how that can be with like tracking in 2020, but you know, you send in a letter or you send in mail and you can track it as far as its journey goes. And, you know, and also we have this thing called the internet, which, you know, imagine a giant invisible cloud where everyone can be connected. It's very hard to explain. I don't even know how to like begin to explain that. But
that sounds ominous.
Yeah. It's a little ominous, but you know, it helps be sure that, you know, you can see where your physical items are going. So even if you know, now we vote by mail or we vote in person. Some states, it's, you know, it's kind of funny. We do, like, you know, how states differ with voting rights in 1770s, 1780s. You know, things are the same here. Different states have different ways of doing things. Like, you know, I think only 4 or 5 states allow, or actually not allow, they have complete vote by mail. You've got Colorado, Washington. Oh, these are states you've never even heard of yet. Imagine the far distant West. We have now acquired those, and they all vote by mail, some of them. But, you know, a lot of other states too, they do early voting where, you know, you can have a month in advance of just going in person whenever it's open. You can cast your ballot in person. And then there are other states where, you know, it's on the day, but they allow vote by mail. So for those who can during a pandemic, it's far healthier for them to do that, and again, secure. So it's just interesting now that, you know, we will have a greater vote by mail this year during a pandemic because people do need to quarantine. Yeah.
It sounds like that is being made extremely difficult by this current government.
Yes, it is. It is being made extremely difficult. You know, they're not having, you know, they're not going to be paying workers extra time or postal workers extra time to deliver mail or to help make sure things arrive on time. So with, you know, an inundated mail system, the only thing I can suggest, and along with, a lot of other people too, are just saying if you are only able to vote by mail, to request your vote by mail application ballot now. And once the ballot comes, which will likely be in October, fill it out and send it directly back. That way it gives the Postal Service time to actually process those ballots and have them arrive at their polling location, which also you could drop off your vote by mail, in the little box at your polling location. So kind of similar to the 1770s, you write on a piece of paper and put it in a box. It's just, there are so many ways to get around it. It's just, I don't know why now we're not trusting the mail service when we've trusted it for, what's the math? 300 years? So, yeah, it's just very interesting. But
It sounds like some things have improved and others have worsened.
much has improved. I think that the trust in the government has definitely gone down as compared to your time, because you knew the people who made it. You knew
that is certainly true, and that was very much on John's mind in forming this nation, that you wouldn't be ruled by some faraway power who had control over so much that he didn't even see. Mm-hmm. That it would be a government of one's peers, that it would be a government of one's colleagues and friends, that you would know, you would understand, and you would have a say. And unfortunately, even though he did not listen when I suggested ensuring that women also had a voice and representation, it was on their minds. It was built in such a way that there were things that they had to set aside in order to achieve independence. And it was very much a regret of Jefferson and Franklin and my husband that the clause abolishing slavery was excised from the draft of the Declaration of Independence, that the Southern colonies would not agree to independence unless that clause remained. Mm-hmm. And it was a compromise, and it was a matter of deep regret and anger. But it was important to John and to Dr. Franklin and to Jefferson that they work together in order to achieve this goal, rather than become a fractioned, separated collection of independent states. Mm-hmm. And I believe that the representation and the participation of women in government was something that they wanted to include as a possibility, even if it was not something that everyone would agree to at the time.
Yeah.
I think that is fair to hope.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully, like I said earlier, in some ways we have made the changes moving towards a more equal union. Ultimately, we had to go to war again over that exact clause, having enslaved peoples. We abolished slavery, which is great, but we found other ways to still take advantage of a system. But, it's interesting because so we had the Civil War and abolished slavery, but we still found ways of basically discriminating against the Black community. And we had Jim Crow laws, which then we fought that again during the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, because there was a lot of voter suppression that happened during those years after the Civil War and into the 1960s, of basically suppressing the vote, because they thought that, there were so many reasons why, I won't even get into it. But it's interesting though, because going back to postal workers is, like I said, there was the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970. And the reason why that happened was because a lot of postal workers at that time, and even now, are at least half of them are Black or minority workers. And so they were trying to take advantage of that and pay them less. And so they went on strike. And because of that strike, that's how they got the collective bargaining agreement. And that kind of sense of empowerment came out of the Civil Rights Act. And it's funny because, we fixed all these things. We have these acts that, help people get paid more. And yet here we are now still trying to take away more money from them. Our government did something 14 years ago. That was in 2006. They wanted the Postal Service to prepay future employees' pension up to 75 years, which that's not something that's ever done in any other federal agency or any other private sector, which is kind of what they've tried to make the Postal Service into, is a independently sustained part of the United States, where they make their money off of actual mail delivery or mail postage stamps. And so now to see that the Postal Service is having issues with budgets, the government has done everything it can pretty much to diminish it with money. And, you can't help look at the fact of there is mail-in voting, and also a lot of the workers are minority. So, you kind of look at the comparison, and I can't help but see it. This is another way of voter suppression. Of if you make the access to voting, whether it be polling location or whatever, if you then eliminate mail-in voting as well, or the easiness of it, it's just one more way to suppress the Black vote, which they've been trying to do since always. So it's sort of interesting when you start looking at the little pieces that kind of put it all together.
And it reminds me greatly of when independency was moving forward. I wrote to John that it was hypocritical in us to be fighting for freedom from England while denying freedom to these people who have been working hard and are in the country against their will, and we are denying them liberty. We are speaking of freedom and liberty while simultaneously taking it away from others. And that it was my great hope that eventually that shackle would be removed. And it sounds as though only parts of it have been removed. Only a degree of freedom, a degree of equality, a degree of equal representation has been allowed. And that is deeply frustrating and angering. Well, and it gives me a sense that the work was all for nothing, that if we could not finally realize that goal of equality, that goal of freedom, of liberty for all, it wasn't all for nothing.
Well, that line of thinking is why petticoats weren't allowed into government in the first place. I don't think that it's all for nothing. And this is, again, I think the great thing about America, this country, is you can, again, keep pushing forward to keep enacting change. And I think that, the base that has been laid down as a government system is brilliant. It's just a matter of constantly pushing it to be even better, because that's the same thing with education, with people as personal identities. The minute you stay stagnant, you immediately lose interest and you become boring. So why would we want to just stay stagnant in the way that we are? I think that with people, with how they learn, how they educate, how they explore their hobbies and interests, that's how the government should be too, is what can we do more? What can we do better? Yeah, we got this figured out, but there's still some issues. And so I don't think it's all for nothing. It's just it's called building blocks on top of themselves of how do you really build a better America. And to me, that's something to be very hopeful for the future.
Yeah. That is heartwarming. That is heartwarming and encouraging.
Yeah. So fear not, Abigail. Things look up. I mean, I think that like I definitely now have like a better scope as to what life was like, and also just communication in general was in the 1770s, you know, by talking with you.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I have learned a great deal as well, and I will do my very best to continue to encourage within my small sphere of influence, to encourage my friends and John and anyone who will listen to improve the lot of women and the lot of our friends in our friends who are in positions of disempowerment and disenfranchisement, people who are slaves, people who are freed slaves. It is very important to us that whatever we can do, that we do the best to create a better life for all of them.
Hear, hear. So anyway, it was great talking with you. And thanks for using my crazy little technology here. Hopefully we get to, you know, talk again about different aspects of life, both here and now, or here and then, I should say.
It would be my honor and my pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.